This is our second unit in our Introduction to Ethics, where we'll start with examining issues about what is the good life and develop our first look at an ethical theory out of our consideration of the good life. To give an overview of where we're going today in a little more detail, we're going to move in to look at the question of what is a good life and look at what values are behind our view of what a good life is. In a sense, trying to find the primary value or the most intrinsic good that we can find in that good life. To do that, we're going to make a distinction between first and order questions, which is a bigger topic in philosophy, but worth to have that background as we approach the good life question. And then we'll use a distinction between intrinsic and instrumental values to help us focus on that core value. Then pause and look at a whole discussion about ethical starting points and assumptions. And then we'll turn our attention to the first illustration of where a good life is given a definition, and we look at the ethical theories associated with that good life. That first ethical theory, of course, is hedonism. And we look at both classical and modern, and we'll look at how it impacts today's culture and society, at least a couple of illustrations of that. So that's where we're going right now. In philosophy, there's a distinction that may be made between first and second order questions. First order questions are the things that you have to discuss first and foremost in order to come to understand the world around us. For example, if you're asking the question, what is real in this world, you are making an inquiry into the most fundamental nature of what's here. What do we really know is real around us? Sometimes it's talked about the difference between our perception of things and the way things they really are. And can we see the real world as it really is? What is this real world? Another first order question is, what's justice? If you're going to live in this world, we should try and struggle to understand what the nature of justice is. What is beautiful? And hence, one of those questions is, what is the good life? What is life all about? And once you've begun to focus on that discussion of the first order question, for example, what is the good life? You then find yourself looking at questions around that topic, which sort of flush it out. And some of these might be first order questions. For example, is the good life lived in the context of justice? Or there might be second order questions as to how you actually go about living that good life. And that would take you into the area of ethics, how you live. So examples of second order questions are, for example, you decide history is something real, then you have to understand how you go about studying history. That's called historiography, and that's a second order question. The philosophy of science is, in a sense, a second order question. Applied ethics, for example, in medical ethics and business ethics and other areas, you have a second order of discussion. Now, in that context, the first great philosopher to really discuss the good life in a really strange setting was Socrates. And he asked a very different question when it came to what is the good life. He asserted that if you don't have a good life, then life's not worth living. For him, he said, the good life was to examine life in all its details, ask questions and debate issues. That was what a good life was. And if you can't do that, then life is not worth living. In a sense, he's asking for free speech. He's asking for the ability to question everything around him. This, of course, was a very unpopular idea when he was teaching and speaking in Athens at the time, and ultimately he paid the ultimate price for that. He was put to death because he kept asking questions. along that same line, people might ask the question, what's the purpose of life? That's a first order question. Why are we here? Does human life have any meaning? What's valuable about human life? What's the cosmos really like? That's the same question as what is real. And there are other questions of this kind. And the first great group of philosophers to look at these sort of general questions were Socrates and his predecessors, the pre-Socratic philosophers along with Socrates. And it is in that context that we realize that when you're asking questions like, what is a good life? What really is it? You begin to have your own ideas challenged. Assuming you're seriously thinking and you are reflecting upon the big questions, when you begin to ask that kind of question, what's the meaning of life? Sometimes the answers are frightening. Some philosophers, for example, have asked, does life have meaning? And they've come up with a conclusion it has no meaning. I wouldn't share their view. I think life does have meaning, but the importance here is that you need to be willing to ask these tough questions and really seek rationally for the answers. Now, there can be very different approaches to answering what is the good life, because that's more our focus in terms of our ethical studies. What is the good life? The various philosophies, ideologies, religion, our culture, our background. Philosophy is not asking you to give these up. And certainly I'm not asking you to give those up. But rather I'm asking you in this course to be open to think about the ideas. For example, some of you may, when we come to the topic of hedonism, say, never, nothing I can learn out of hedonism, no value, no connection. I hope we can surprise you by today, sometime today, in showing you that hedonism probably does affect you. And in surprising ways. So with that in mind, let us think about the good life. What is a good life? Well, we would begin by thinking about what is good in the good life. If it's a good life, there's got to be something that makes it good. Now, surely that has to be something which is an end in itself. It's got to be intrinsic. It's got to be so important and good that it is not a means to something else. It's an end in itself. I'll come to this distinction, intrinsic and instrumental good, in a moment. But first, let's have a look at the sort of things that might make up a good life. Happiness, for example. I suspect that many of you who are watching this video could remember your mum or your dad or both saying to you, all I want for you is to be happy. And perhaps that conversation took place when you were having a vigorous disagreement with your parents as to what you should be doing with your life. And you realize that your view of happiness and their view of happiness were two different things. Of course, theirs was mature and yours was young, and perhaps there was something you could have learned from it. But nonetheless, you were a person and you could have your own views, and your parents had to accept that you were willing to be a person who could define your own life and define happiness for yourself, be it wise or unwise. Another form of good life could be a peaceful life. Plato, for example, was very impressed with the idea that we needed to live a life that was surrounded by the context of justice. That the good was always driving the just, and the just would be the characteristic of a good life. For others, and perhaps even for many of us today, at the heart of good life is family. Perhaps it's health. Perhaps in our society, a good life, a life when you are beautiful, or lived in the context of beauty. Or is life lived where there's love and you experience love? Now, I've already suggested that such things need to be intrinsic goods. And that gives us a need to just pause for a moment and think about intrinsic and instrumental values. The textbook has a discussion on this as well, so I'm sort of combining that as an example here. Something is intrinsically valuable or intrinsically good, an intrinsic good, if it's a value or a good in itself. It's an end in itself. Happiness, pleasure, love, friendship. I've given you the Tao's, Schaefer Tao's definition, and you can see that one for yourself. And something is instrumentally valuable if it's valuable because of the good things it brings about. For example, chocolate is a good thing. I think it's a good thing. Why is it a good thing? Because it brings about some sort of happiness or pleasure. Clearly, it is an instrument for producing something in itself. Sturdy shoes. I happen to have sturdy shoes in the mind for another reason as I prepare this particular discussion. They're very good because if you go hiking, you need sturdy shoes. They protect your ankles from twisting, and they're very valuable themselves. They're valuable in producing that safety. The vaccinations, money, and the list goes on. By the way, if you're studying economics, don't confuse these terms with some other terms similar to them in economics. They're different. So we have intrinsic good, something that's good in itself, an instrumental value or good. And what is important, I am suggesting, and indeed philosophy has suggested, that when you are thinking about the good life, we're really thinking about intrinsic goods. But before we turn our attention to the first example of an intrinsic good, which is driving a concept of the good life and out of which we developed a system of ethics or moral behavior, let's just stop for a moment and realize that there are some people who would suggest that what we are engaging in this course is a futility. It's just impossible to develop a moral philosophy of any kind. And everyone that has tried it has ended up with a bankrupt conclusion, because all views are equally valuable, all views are equally plausible, so you can't choose between them. Or they're intellectual nonsense. I'm not going to go into the detail. It's called moral skepticism. I would suggest to you, I think you can gather the same from reading a textbook, that the study of ethics, the serious study of ethics, is a worthwhile exercise. It is true that as an individual, you can have any system of ethics you like. But that concept of moral skepticism breaks down when you begin to realize that we live in community. We live in an immediate community of our own family or social group. We live in, if you like, a culture with its own moral tradition, with its own rules, if you will, things which that culture says are good and are bad, that are right and that are wrong, and they're very powerful. And perhaps even more significant is that vast numbers of the laws we make that control the entire nation, that cross across all the cultural groups of the diversity that make up these United States or the Western world, and indeed the world, when you come to international law, these are, if you like, standards about what is right and what is wrong. The International Court of Justice, for example, that certain kinds of killing are so heinous that they're a crime against humanity. They're the worst kind of moral wrong there is. And we would say that it is wrong to do that. And hence that's an ethical valuation. And hence it's important to be able to critically and seriously and soberly think about those views. So while autonomy and freedom are high values in the West, and we value them, and they're what we want to exercise in our own life, we have to realize that we do live in community, and there are times when our autonomy has to take second place to ethical norms around us, depending on the various groups we might be in at the time. So with that in mind, we move on, and we just realise that there's something else that just is inherent to human beings. We're all involved in making judgments, and we believe it's appropriate to say, that was wrong. We believe that everyone can be morally fallible. You can make mistakes morally. You can sin morally, if you like. And we value certain things that are just valuable in themselves, and we think to violate them is terrible. For example, friendship's so valuable. When people, we talk about breakdown of a relationship as hurting, as being hurtful and harmful, which is a bad, not a good. We don't view, in ethical, we don't view it as that you have to do the impossible. Moral obligations can't impose the impossible on you. For example, you couldn't have a moral obligation to stop all burglary in your community. You may have a moral obligation to prevent a burglary if you can, but you don't have the moral obligation to do the impossible. And we have a sense in which children are not as morally accountable as adults. We just have a sense that there's a difference. I mean, how many parents have watched their children do something terrible and laughed? Not because they're saying what the child did was good, but because this is a child. If this were an adult, it would be a whole different story. Speaking of children, is there any topic that they don't understand better than that's not fair? Fairness and justice are just inherent to us. So, and deliberately hurting people is something we say is wrong. Today we've reached a better understanding, I think, of the problems of bullying. Hurting people in any form is wrong. We understand it's bad. But years ago, when I was growing up, you know, if you're being bullied, your dad would tell you, suck it up or punch it up, you know, one of the two. Well, if you're a boy, that's what you're told. You know. Anyway, won't go there. Equals ought to be treated equally. Serious and ongoing pain is bad, agony is bad. And the list goes on with things that we hold as values. They're all there. And we're inherently moral creatures. We just seem to have to make ethical and moral judgments. But what does that mean for us as we study? I've mentioned this before. We are involved in the academic study of ethics, where we're making serious reflection and critical reflection on the values and the theories and the application of theories to life. We're using reason, and we're particularly looking at the justifications or the reasons people put forward. Do those reasons stand up to critical evaluation? Do they alleged moral values we're applying stand up to evaluation? And so the key actions here are reflection, open to reviewing justifications, slow process sometimes and painful, open to listening to different views, willing to avoid the ad hominem argument. You're a nutcase, you're bad, you're wrong, rather than listening to the argument. And so, and of course, being willing to just not parrot the local latest cultural position on any issue. It might be a very sacred issue. Willing to ask the hard questions. Well, with those things in mind, we want to come to a very ancient theory which has modern application, dealing with hedonism. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to get beyond Hollywood and entertainment. While putting pictures together, I try to find a sobering one which would just say, look, we've got to get beyond what you see in the picture. Rather, I want us to reflect, and to do so I thought it would be good for us to start in a slightly different position from the textbook, and to go back into ancient Greek philosophy, to look at the hedonists there who were part of the pre-Socratic movement, the philosophers who began thinking serious about ethics before the time of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, and to see their view. And perhaps given that this is not a course on philosophy. We would have had these things introduced in a different context. We'll just pause for a moment and put the historical context first. The Greek world of the 4th, 5th and 6th century before the current era was the time of Athens and the Greeks being at their cultural zenith. At a time when the Parthenon was constructed, when the great Greek cities throughout what we now call the Mediterranean and somewhat the Middle East were being built. A time of great thinkers like Thales and Heraclitus, Parmenides, Protagoras, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Their names and dates are in the centre column that you can see in front of you on this slide. There are some historical events either side, giving you some context in which this took place. But we're certainly talking about a long time ago, more than 2,500 years. And it's worthy just to remind ourselves that Greek civilization was much more than Athens. There were Greek cities scattered around the Aegean Sea, and not just around the Aegean Sea, but also along the coastline of the eastern Mediterranean, and even as far south as the Tigris-Euphrates River, you can see there. Each of these cities were, in a sense, a copy of Athens, with town hall, with libraries built within the framework often of the temples, with commerce passing between them, and written communication passing between them, the pre-Socratics interacting with each other. And in serious thought, what is a good life? And the earliest serious thinkers about this were Democritus, one of many, but I picked out two major ones, Democritus and Cyrenaics. I beg your pardon, Aristippus. And Democritus was better known in ancient Greek philosophy for his work on what we would call today atomic theory, atomism. That the world was made up of little tiny atoms, which is the most interesting thing. But he was called the laughing philosopher because the value of cheerfulness or happiness. And in a sense, he was the first philosopher to say that a good life was one where you were happy, where you found pleasure in life and you enjoyed life. A development of that was the ultra-hedonist Greek school of the Cyrenaics. They taught that the only intrinsic good was pleasure. A pretty dramatic saying. In other words, the only thing that's really good is pleasure. And they didn't mean the absence of pain. They meant positively enjoyable momentary sensations. That was the best part of life. That was life. In a sense, all the images that might come to mind when you think of hedonism are possible in this group. But it's unfair to simply see them as wanton revelers. Rather, they did recognize the value of social obligation. And they also acknowledged that pleasure, literally physical pleasure, could be obtained from altruism, doing good things. So there's a sense in which typically in that Greek cultural setting they had a social conscience. A successor in this whole area was Epicurus and the Epicureans. Now, it's important to distinguish the form of hedonism associated with Epicurus and his predecessors, because there's a sense in which his school was quite different. Their view of pleasure was not momentary sensations of pleasure, but rather a state of tranquility, an absence of fear, an absence of pain. And what was important about this state of tranquility for Epicurus was that it was obtained through understanding the world and understanding the limits to one's desires. Now, when you're reading the textbook, you'll see some questions that the textbook takes you through in terms of the limits of desires and the problem with desires and the modern desire theory. And I think it's well written and well done. I think you'll benefit from reading it. However, this approach of Epicurus and his followers began to really focus on the fact that the good life was one which was lived without pain. And this good life lived without pain, especially understood in this sense of a state of being, is really quite different from the other form of hedonism, and indeed many of the modern manifestations of hedonism that we think about. Now, with that in mind, I'm going to refer you back to the textbook, those first 4 chapters, where you'll have a very thorough introduction to desire theory and all the modern manifestations of what you might call hedonism. And I think it would be valuable to read that. However, it's very clear when you read that that the Shefa is not in favour of hedonism and recognises it's there and really wants to play it down. And yet, I want to take a slightly different position. I think that hedonism has a profound impact on life in our community today and what we see as a good life. And I want to suggest 2 areas. And as you're looking at cases and trying to work out what ethical theory does this represent, perhaps this discussion that follows will help you. Really 2 illustrations, if you will. The first concerns the good life being a healthy life. You can see that that's inherently a hedonistic idea. And the good life is free from being out of control and from incurable pain. So let's look at the first of those, the good life, healthy life. Where in today's society will you see this kind of thing being driven home, and how do we look at it? Well, I've just picked one illustration. You could pick others. There are numerous of them. Given that we are approaching the silly season of another round of elections, some are asserting that all citizens have a right to a good life. And that's a good life in terms of having health care, having good health, that you have the right to be healthy. You have the expectation when you go to the doctor that he'll fix you. And that's his job. And if he can't do that, he's failed. After all, the good life is a healthy life. Now, I think I like that idea. I like the idea of being healthy. But it's worthy of, amidst all the political hoo-ha of Medicare for all and free health care, there's some good questions to ask. So we can recognise the debate and then ask some critical questions. Is it universally true that a good life is a healthy life? Or put another way, can an unhealthy life be a good life? And I think I would join with Shefa and say, this is part of the intriguing nature of life, that an unhealthy life could be a good life. But even if it's true that a good life is a healthy life, does that truth give a person a right and society an obligation to provide us with a healthy life? I'm not trying to enter into a political debate here. I'm simply trying to do a critical analysis of what's going on. There may be a different way of approaching that topic, but I leave you with that as a thought. And when you're looking at cases, you can see that this is one way of looking at how hedonism may be coming in our culture, because it's a hedonistic value. A good life is a healthy life. And that's not a bad thing in itself. Similarly, the issue of ongoing, agonizing, incurable pain. I've already mentioned that Socrates said that only certain kinds of life were worth living. And he insisted that the unexamined life wasn't worth living. Well, it seems to be a very Socratic idea to say that the life that is experiencing ongoing, agonizing, incurable pain is not worth living. But is it? If the following is rational and reasonable, and some argue it is not, if a good life is not lived without pain, is one lived without, I'll start again. If a good life is one lived without pain, then a bad life is one lived in pain. Hence a bad life is not real life, and hence it's not worth living. That's the kind of argument. Now, there are multiple debates about what we now know as euthanasia. In the second volume, you'll be looking for your cases, and you'll have assigned cases in this book. For example, in chapters 22 and 23 of the book, there's a whole discussion about two major articles concerning euthanasia. I put them to you, and we'll no doubt be talking about those in the course of this work with forums and WebExes. Although, here's a thought for reflection for you. And again, it's looking at the reasoning behind what happens. In Washington State, in the 70s and 80s, there was a great debate about physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. And one of the powerful arguments, and very effective arguments put forward, was that people who are suffering agonizing, ongoing, incurable pain are people who should be given the opportunity to have assisted suicide, physician-assisted suicide. The legislation was passed, and Washington State, Oregon, and some other states, in fact a number of other states today, have physician-assisted suicide. There are many safeguards theoretically built in, and we should critically look at those. And we should critically look at the question of whether you really do have a right to determine the moment and time of your own death. Might seem strange to do that. After all, aren't you in control of your own life? Shouldn't you control your own life? Well, that's another discussion. But remember, the core argument in favour of physician-assisted suicide in Washington State was ongoing pain. After some time, the American Medical Association, or doctors associated with the AMA, conducted a survey. They received 828 physician responses, which covered 207 cases. These cases described what the patient's conditions were, what they asked for, why they asked for it, how they fulfilled the various legislative obligations. And some interesting conclusions came out of it. First, as could be expected, the diagnosis applicable to those who had requested and had the right to ask for physician-assisted suicide were people suffering from cancer, neurological diseases, and AIDS, vast majority. This is let me remind myself of the date, 1996. Now those were the conditions. But these same patients were asked to say why they wanted to have physician-assisted suicide. No question, many of them were suffering pain. Many of them were suffering other major problems. And our hearts must go out to them. But what the patients listed as their concerns, as the physicians noted them, were the following. I've highlighted them for you. There were worries about loss of control, worried about being a burden, being dependent on others for personal care, and the loss of dignity. Pain was not listed. So these are the question here. What does this survey suggest these patients saw as the good life? After all, the heart of the legislation was freedom from pain, because that was a good life. But in fact, there were other things. Well, we won't go any further on that at this point in time, but we'll leave that with you. As promised, with each of our units, we'll close with looking at things that are important to you, to know and learn from the unit. You need to be able to discuss the following first and second order questions. And what is the good life? Be able to distinguish between instrumental and intrinsic goods and their impact on definitions of good life. Be able to reflect upon your own ethical assumptions and starting points. Know something about classical hedonism. Be able to distinguish Epicurean hedonism from the others. Have an understanding of the desire theories discussions, and be able to discuss some of the impacts that hedonism has in modern ethical reflection. I've given you two here to begin with, and hopefully that will help you make sense of it while we're looking at it, and also to have a sense in which you are getting a tool now to start looking at the cases and the requirements posed upon you for your forums, your submissions of the forum, and your responses, and then our discussions in the WebExes.